if you put a certain amount of money down on a product, that it's going to become one of these blockbuster drugs. So there's every disincentive in the world once you've done some 50 million, 100 million in research development, and you get to the stages where you're actually testing these drugs on people, that there's all kinds of jobs that'll be lost and all kinds of money to be lost when it's found out that this drug is dangerous or it's not as effective as a placebo. So it does happen. There are people in all these places, even in drug companies and in the FDA, who have integrity, but the whole system is set up to disincentivize that and to incentivize people doing things that are going to create unsafe and ineffective drugs. Once these drugs become approved, then there's every incentive for these pharmaceutical companies to want to use these drugs for as many things as possible. So for example, way back, the whole antipsychotic industry, 25 years ago, drugs like Haldol or Thorazine or Trilofan, it was only a $200 million a year industry. It was very rare that people would be labeled as crazy enough or wild enough or psychotic enough to be medicated with these major tranquilizing drugs. But the drug industry discovered that we could use a lot of these newer drugs that don't have these drugs called Zyprexa and Risperdal and Seroquel, that we don't have to just use them for people who've been labeled psychotically agitated. We can use them for all kinds of people who we'd like to control a lot more. So some kid in a classroom. And so all of a sudden you went from an industry, a total industry of antipsychotic drugs being a $250 million industry, to Zyprexa a couple of years back, one antipsychotic drug alone topping $3 billion a year. Okay, by being used for all kinds of ways, including, chilling out people, old folks in nursing homes who, were understaffed, chilling out kids in classrooms here who were driving their teachers maybe a little bit crazy. So you can just expand the usage of these things. How does that zombify and pacify a population? Well, it's quite obvious. I mean, it's literally write pages out of Brave New World, Huxley's Brave New World. You've got a population where you've got giant pharmaceutical companies who are incentivized to create drugs that are used for more and more populations that are creating some degree of havoc. There's no institutions that are stopping that. The American Psychiatric Association, they work in financial partnership with pharmaceutical companies. National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, so-called a family group, they take millions of dollars from drug companies in grants. National Institute of Mental Health, which is the government agency, there's a revolving door of employment between the NIMH and the drug companies, same with the Food and Drug Administration. So there's no major institutions blocking this huge growth of drugs for people out there, which more it's become sort of almost mainstream to sort of see the similarities between Soma, the drug used in Brave New World, and the all the psychiatric drugs that are being used now. It's a drug to kind of drugs to kind of get people to chill out. I ask kids all the time, what's the actual effect on you of that ADHD drug, that Ritalin, that Adderall? All these other drugs, Dexedrine that they've used, what's the actual effect? Well, for many of them, and their parents and their teachers, agree it doesn't have any kind of effect in making them pay more attention. But for some of them it does. Some of them, superficially, they look like they are paying attention. They're certainly more manageable and more compliant in a classroom. That does, in fact, happen. And those are the kids I'm really interested in. I say, well, what's happening? What's happening to you? And they're saying, well, what happens to me, Bruce, is like, well, I know at some level I'm just as bored as ever, but I don't care as much. And I'm just not as antsy or as agitated about being bored. Sort of in similar ways to people who use nicotine and smoke cigarettes on crappy jobs that they're in. They know they're just as bored as ever, but if they could get their nicotine hit, it takes the edge away from that. And so that's in lots of ways what psychotropic drugs do. Psychotropic drug are illegal drugs or psychotropic drugs like marijuana and heroin, and psychiatric drugs are all psychotropic drugs. And what that means is that they're drugs that affect your neurotransmitters. Some of the famous neurotransmitters nowadays are serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine, which, by the way, are the neurotransmitters that cocaine affects. And the same neurotransmitters that amphetamines affect, which are kind of synthetic cocaine. And that's what you give to kids with ADHD, these synthetic cocaine amphetamines. That's what they're being given. It doesn't have the same effect when you're taking something in pill form as it is when you're snorting it or when you're IVing something, but these drugs are very, very, very much similar. And almost all of these drugs that are psychotropic drugs, some of them are more likely to be uppers, right? The amphetamines, some of them are more likely to be downers, but what they all have in common is they disconnect you from what you're really feeling. And so you ask people all the time who are on these stuff, or you ask kids, it's like, they'll say stuff like, well, I think I used to care about that, and I think I still care about it, but I don't feel as much caring. I think I hate that person. I think I hate that guy who's mean to me, but I don't feel that hate as much. It takes the edge off of negative emotions. It takes the edge off of positive emotions here. And, for some people, they call that successful treatment. For guys like me, this is like Brave New World.
Visit Infowars.com and PrisonPlanet.com. When you're on the sites, you can also tune in 24 hours a day to my daily radio broadcast. There's also a free iPhone app to listen to the syndicated radio show when and where you want.